this moment of awakening is synonymous with recognition. And we've been talking about recognition quite a bit, right? So the moment of awakening, recognition, two interchangeable concepts. We already know what recognition is, so we know what moment of awakening is. Recognition is the required first step for any member of the oppressed group and the group as such to liberate itself from the submersion in the state of oppression. I have to recognize my oppression if I want to free myself from that oppression. If I don't recognize that I'm oppressed, if I refuse to acknowledge that I'm oppressed, I will remain to be oppressed and exploited. I need to recognize the system, the mechanism of my oppression, and fight against that, rage against the machine, right? I need to rage against the machine. He has a great quote, and I want to cite it. The first bullet point under the moment of awakening is, quote, "The oppressed must see examples of the vulnerability of the oppressor," right? The oppressed must see examples of the vulnerability of the oppressor so that a contrary conviction can begin to grow within them. And the question is, well, what is this contrary conviction, right? If I see in this relationship, right, vulnerability, VUL. If I see instances of vulnerability within members of the oppressor, right, in the oppressor class, then what I recognize, right, insofar as I see that the oppressor class is fallible, which they are, prima facie fallible, we're all human beings, we're prone to error. Once I see that they're fallible, then I recognize my ability to, for all, and we'll talk about this, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but for all practical purposes, begin the first semblances of rebellion. Rebellion brews in a recognition of vulnerability. I thought you were the only source of power. I'm coming to recognize that you are not really the authority of power. So why would I subordinate myself to you if there's a higher power than you, right? If you're getting your power from somewhere else, right? If, for example, in most coups and most revolutions, it is a recognition that it's so obvious, but people fail to see the thing that's right in front of their face, is that the power of any political regime, government, monarchy, anywhere in the globe comes from the people, period. It's like the first rule of social philosophy, political science, international relations. It's like rule one, right? Governments get their power from the people. You can exploit that power, but it comes from the people. Once the people recognize that the source of governmental power is actually in the seat of, couched in terms of the people, then the people can actually make change. It's not the government that makes change, right? I mean, they can. Really, the ability to transform society, this transformative process, according to Freire and every theorist I've ever read in my life, sits in the people, but the people need to recognize that, right? As long as the people are distracted and completely disinterested and unmotivated, well, they'll be pacified. But as soon as they start to get aware, as soon as they start to see what the game is, there's going to be requirement for change, and that's when it happens, right? Because then regimes, political dynasties, whatever have you, recognize the power that the people have and that the people are actually going to implement it, right? So we recognize as the people the vulnerability of those who've been put in positions of power to govern us. And it is specifically that vulnerability that we use to formalize our rebellion, right? And it's through this act of struggle, through this act of rebellion, through this act of sort of strategic dismantling of the oppressor's power that we come to eradicate the oppressor-oppressed, the OO consciousness, right? The oppressor-oppressed contradiction. Okay, next point. The moment of awakening in the world of practice, there's a disregard for the state of one's oppression. And this leads to further exploitation, and we've said that, right? If you don't know that you're oppressed, right? If you don't know that someone's telling you what to do, information is coming from me to you, directions are coming from me to you, directives are coming from me to you, you know, so on and so forth, then you just wait for me to tell you the next thing, right? If you're doing this, then you've subordinated yourself, right, to passivity. What you do in response to this is you challenge that passivity by imposing, right, by recognizing the vulnerability of those in power and challenging them, right? And it's through this challenge, it's through this attempt, this vying, if you will, and it really is a vying for power. Right? It's through this vying for power that a sense of equalization becomes inevitable, right? It always, I mean, the scales go like this, but there are moments in time where it's equal, and though the peace might only last a few weeks or a few months or a few years, it's always good to be able to attain a state of peace, because in a state of peace, obviously you have a balance of power. You cannot have a state of peace where there's an imbalance in power. It's logically impossible, right? And there's many people who've tried to argue for peace with imbalances of power, but I don't accept any of those arguments. Next point. The oppressed must learn to be constructively rebellious, and I spoke about that, right? We recognize that constructive rebellion is a consequence of a recognition, right? This exactly what we're talking about, this moment of awareness, this recognition, this instance when I recognize that the oppressor isn't all that I thought the oppressor was. The oppressor isn't as powerful as I thought it was. The oppressor isn't as desirable as I thought it initially was, right? The glamour, the fame, the trappings are all sort of, it's all sort of veneer, right? It's all the sheen without any substance, right? And it's that vapid, empty, hollow existence. It's the recognition of that. Once that moment happens, and once that moment happens on a cultural, social level, guaranteed everything will collapse. The dominoes fall, and there's a rebellion, right? And as I said, it doesn't have to be a violent rebellion. Though Freire and I have spoken about the role of violence in the act of rebellion, it can be an intellectual transformation among members of the population as well. So praxis then has three elements, right? There are three elements to praxis. The three elements to praxis. The first element of praxis is reflection. Reflection, contemplation, engagement in theoretical analysis, theoretical discourse, abstract contemplation, abstract thought, abstract conceptualization. As philosophers, this is my meal ticket, right? Reflection is what most theorists, not just philosophers, most theorists engage in very, very intense and abstracted reflection. It's not an easy thing to do, but abstract thought is one facet, one arm of, or one prong, because it's three, so it can't quite be an arm, but one prong, of this this idea of praxis. So reflection. The next part is critical dialogue, right? Remember what we said is that in talking about, so that trust must be established between respective members of the oppressed group, right? If I have a sense of trust among members of the oppressed group, then obviously what's going to end up happening is I'll be able to engage in discourse. I'll be able to engage in dialogue. I trust this individual. I have a sense that this individual has my best interests at stake. I trust them. I can disclose information. This is inherently important if I'm attempting to transform the mechanism of my oppression, right? It's going to require socialized discourse, and that discourse has to be one rooted and grounded in trust. So the first element of praxis is reflection. The second element of praxis is critical dialogue. And the last element of praxis, as Freire says, is action. Right? Action becomes the last. Right? You have to get something done. Right? There has to be some work done in order for this reflection to actually mean something in the world. He has a very interesting claim. The next point says that true reflection must lead to action. Right? True reflection, if what you're doing is genuine reflection, then it has to lead to action. Otherwise, it is, quote, armchair revolution, right? Armchair revolution. I'm in my office at a university. I have my chair right behind the camera, and I consider myself, before I read Freire, I considered myself a bit of an activist, right? But Freire's conception of activist is, though he doesn't introduce an alternative term for it, he refutes this, right? Because you end up being an armchair revolutionary. So I published a couple of books, I wrote a couple of articles, I go to conferences, I give some speeches, students present a couple of articles, they publish a couple of books, they give a couple of, so we're armchair revolutionaries. And for me, as a young academic, the worst thing I can possibly think of being is an armchair revolutionary. I don't want to be the type of instructor, I'm not knocking people who are, but I personally don't want to be the type of instructor that he's talking about, right? I don't want to be the type of person that is just engaged in reflection and critical dialogue. Actually, you can't even get to critical dialogue, right? I don't want to be the person just engaged in reflection. So, for example, I'm doing this series on Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Pretty reflection, right? Pretty high, pretty abstract. You know, a lot of time went into it, a lot of time preparing, a lot of time disclosing it, but it's all really reflective. What good is this going to be? All of this work that I'm doing to put this video out, to compile it, to put it out into the world, if both I and you do nothing about it. We just say, oh yeah, you know, did you watch Dr. Campbell's YouTube video on Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Yeah, it was really, really detailed. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, man. I wrote a paper on it for class and, you know, it helped me with my notes. Okay, I failed. I failed. According to Freire, I failed. Why? Because I haven't implemented this action, right? I can't wait on you to implement this action. I can't assume that, I hope it's the case, I hope it's the case that even if one person watches this video and one person really goes out, buys the book, thinks about what Freire says, understands the role of their own oppression, uses what Freire said in this book, along with the lectures, and actually goes out and makes the world a better place, brings about some peace, brings about a sense of consideration, of equal recognition of our human existence. The likelihood of that happening, though, is small, right? It really is, and I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that it's probably not going to be the case that someone's going to watch these videos and actually go out and do something. I hope it is the case. I hope I'm wrong, but I can't assume that the video is going to have that type of impact. What I do know is that I, as a professor, as an educator, quote-unquote professor, I don't really think of myself in that way because I've read Freire, I have a responsibility, right? I have a responsibility to myself, right? If I subscribe to Freire's concepts, and I do, that I have to make sure that what I'm doing when I'm engaged in this process of reflection isn't just armchair revolutionary, right? I'm not going to be an armchair revolutionary. I need to be on the ground. So I've formed NGO, I'm working in the community with people, and I'm trying to physically bring about change, right? It can't just be the case that I'm on the pulpit preaching, that I'm in video saying, hey, look how smart I am, learn from me, learn from me. I have to put myself in a position where I don't know, where I need to depend on others for their information, and in collaboration through this critical dialogue arrive at some transformation, right? That's the only way it can work. So my personal goal is that this does motivate somebody to make the world a better place, but I can't wait for you to do it. I got to do it. So one of us got to do it first. And